This video will discuss strategies for dividing by eights. The most efficient strategy when dividing by eights, and really any number, is to think multiplication. So when I have 24 divided by 8, instead I'm going to think 8 times what is 24? And I know 8 times 3 is 24, so therefore I know 24 divided by 8 is 3, and here's why. In division, we start off with the total. So this is called the dividend. In multiplication, the total ends up at the end, and that's the product. So these other numbers represent groups or how many in a group, and those, especially in division, can be flipped. So if I know the total, I know how many groups. If I can really relate this to multiplication and I can figure out this other factor, I now, using that information, can solve my division problem. So that's the most efficient way to solve really any division problem. But what if I just don't remember that multiplication problem? There's a couple strategies that will work. The first strategy to think about would be skip counting. One way to interpret division is to think of this problem as 64 divided by 8 would be how many eights, how many groups of 8 are in 64? And so in order to figure that out, I could skip count by eights. So as I skip count by eights, I'm going to keep track of how many groups there are on my fingers. So here's what that would sound like. 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56, 64. So if you were kind of counting along, you heard that I counted 8 times. So there are 8 groups of 8 in 64. So therefore, I know that 64 divided by 8 is 8. So that strategy works. This time it was accurate, but it's not so efficient, and also counting by eights is not that easy. So is there a more efficient way we could solve divided by eights if we don't instantly know? So the way to think about this is we're going to kind of chunk this out. We're going to really kind of push on a bit the distributive property of multiplication. We're going to use that and apply it a little bit to division. So we're going to take 48 divided by 8, and we're going to use a fact we already know, a divided by 8 fact. So that's going to be key. This part here can't change. We can't break this part up. 48 is our total, but we could take part of that total and break it down a bit to think about, make this easier. Well, I know 40 divided by 8 is 5. And I really love my 5s facts. Whenever I can get this to be 5, it really can help me make the problem easier. It makes the mental math part easier, because here's why. I had a total of 48. You'll see that I've used 40, and so now I know there's 8 left in that total. So I still have to take that 8, and remember, I'm still dividing by 8. That part hasn't changed. I know 8 divided by 8 was 1, and when I put those quotients together, I can find my quotient for 48 divided by 8. Using that same strategy, here's a different model to think about that. In this case, I have 56 divided by 8. If I can't remember the multiplication problem, I could kind of chunk this out. So you'll see that my rectangle has an area of 56. My side length here is 8. So really I'm thinking of 8 times what is 56. We're really relating it to multiplication. But if I just don't know that, I could use facts that I do know. So I'm going to break up this rectangle, and I'm going to think of a fact I do know. Well, like I said, I really like my facts that end up in 5s. I know that 40 divided by 8 is 5. So you'll notice I'm dividing by 8 because this side length is 8. So this rectangle, I'm looking at 40, the area, and I want to know if this side length is 8, what's this side? Well, I know 5 times 8 is 40. So I had 56. Here's another great reason why 5s can turn out really nice. I have to subtract 40. Well, that's pretty easy to do since it's a tens number. I know that there's 16 remaining. So that means I know the area of this box here, this part of this rectangle, is 16. But I still have to divide by 8. That doesn't change because the side length is still 8. So 16 divided by 8 is 2. So I know that my total is 56. I'm dividing by 8, and this other side length is going to be my quotient. And when I add those two side lengths together, I know that 56 divided by 8 is 7. So just to review, when dividing by 8, you really want to think first about the multiplication problem. I want to think 8 times what equals 72. If I know that, I can instantly find this answer and I'm done. But again, if I don't know it, then I'm going to kind of move to the next most efficient way, and I'm going to think, what fact do I know? So I've already told you that I really like facts that end equaling 5. It makes things easier, but I want to show you a different division fact to show you that it works for anything. It doesn't have to be a 5. So maybe in this case, I know 8 times 8 is 64, right? Like that's a fact a lot of students know. So if I know 64 divided by 8 is 8, then I have to think, well, I had 72 and I've used up 64 of that total. So what's remaining? So this is why 5 facts are nicer. I would have ended up with 40 here, and that would have been easier to subtract. This isn't horrible, but there's some regrouping going on, or maybe you're going to think, what's the distance from 64 to 72? So I know the distance from 64 to 72 is 8. So I have 8 remaining. I still have to divide by 8. The divisor hasn't changed, and I know that there's 1. 8 divided by 8 is 1. So now I take my 2 quotients, 8 plus 1, and to find out that 72 divided by 8 is 9. I know that this may seem a lot more work than the skip counting piece we talked about in the beginning, but as you work with it it will become much more efficient. You'll be able to do this much quicker than I'm able actually to talk through it. And the awesome thing about this strategy is it applies to any number. Like we could divide numbers in the hundreds by 8. You could kind of chunk it out like we've been doing, and you could come up with an answer fairly quickly. So remember, when dividing by 8s, you're going to think multiplication. Think what times 8 equals that dividend. If that doesn't work, you're going to use a fact you already know, kind of chunk that out, use something you already know, and then your last strategy, which you can rely on, which would probably be the least efficient, but you could always skip count by 8s until you get to the dividend.